Welcome to Diagnosing Health Care, a podcast featuring thought-provoking conversations about the latest legal, policy, and regulatory issues in healthcare. While these issues may seem like hurdles, we'll also look at the business opportunities and solutions that exist. Diagnosing Healthcare is brought to you by the healthcare lawyers at Epstein Becker Green, a leading law firm serving clients in the healthcare industry nationwide.
Today on Diagnosing Healthcare, we will analyze the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's latest guidance on clinical decision support software and discuss the challenges industry faces as it attempts to make sense of and comply with the newest guidance. Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Jessika Tuazon. I'm an attorney in Epstein Becker Green's healthcare and life sciences practice based out of our Los Angeles office. Healthcare providers and patients alike are increasingly looking to digital health technologies to help deliver safe and effective healthcare. With an increase in research and innovation over the last several years, industry has made significant strides in developing novel tools for healthcare providers and institutions who are looking to provide timely solutions and personalized treatments, as well as for patients who are seeking greater access to information to make better informed decisions about their own health. Clinical decision support software is just one type of digital health technology that is reimagining modern healthcare, where products have contributed to increased quality of care, enhanced health outcomes, and the avoidance of errors and adverse events. Historically, these products have been used to help inform patient diagnosis, identify available treatments, store and share health information, and to streamline certain administrative processes. After a long wait for clarity on how FDA intends to regulate clinical decision support software, the FDA issued a final guidance document in September 2022, setting forth the agency's current views. To the dismay of many, FDA signaled that it intends to tighten its oversight on such software tools, resulting in additional regulatory hurdles for certain technologies, which some fear could stymie innovation in this field. On today's podcast, we are taking a deeper look at the history of FDA's guidance and regulation of clinical decision support software, how this document may cause confusion for industry, and what companies can do in response to the agency's guidance. On today's show, we will discuss the FDA's latest guidance on clinical decision support software, the lawfulness of FDA's approach in issuing this guidance, and questions industry may have as it attempts to implement the guidance in practice. If you like what you hear today, please subscribe to the show. Diagnosing Healthcare is available wherever you get your podcasts. Joining our discussion today is Brad Thompson, a healthcare and life sciences partner at Epstein Becker Green's Washington, D.C. office. He also serves as a chairman of the board and chief data scientist of EBG Advisors, Inc., a national strategy and management consultancy that serves the healthcare and life sciences industries. Brad has extensive experience advising clients on federal regulatory requirements impacting various digital health technologies, including clinical decision support software, digital therapeutics, behavioral health apps, and many others. He also counsels clients that develop or use machine learning and artificial intelligence tools. As a fun fact, last year, Brad also graduated from the University of Michigan with a master's in data science. And in addition to his work counseling companies, Brad has served as regulatory counsel for a number of trade associations and industry coalitions, including the Clinical Decision Support Coalition and Combination Products Coalition. Thank you for taking the time to join me on Diagnosing Healthcare, Brad.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great, me too. Clinical decision support is a widely used term that may have different meanings in different contexts. Before we dive into our discussion on FDA's most recent guidance, I thought it might be helpful to provide a little bit of background and context for our listeners. In the Food and Drug Administration's Safety and Innovation Act Health IT report issued in 2014, clinical decision support was described as providing healthcare providers and patients with knowledge and person-specific information, intelligently filtered or presented at appropriate times to enhance health and healthcare. At the time this report was issued, FDA stated that it intended to focus its oversight only on a limited set of software functionalities that provide clinical decision support and pose higher risks to patients. 2 years later, in 2016, the 21st Century Cures Act amended the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to formally carve out certain clinical decision support software functions from the statutory definition of medical device. Specifically, the statute sets forth 4 criteria that a product must meet in order to be excluded from the definition of a medical device, and products that are excluded from the definition would not be subject to FDA regulation and oversight. Following the Cures Act, the FDA has worked to prepare guidance for industry intended to clarify the scope of the agency's oversight of certain clinical decision support software intended for healthcare professionals. I think it's important to note that although FDA guidance is not legally binding on industry, it does provide insight into how FDA is thinking about a particular topic and sets a framework for its approach to regulating in that space. Today, the focus of our conversation will be on the most recent guidance document issued by FDA on clinical decision support. Taking a bit of a step back, Brad, can you walk us through some of the regulatory history leading up to the issuance of the September 2022 final guidance?
Sure, Jessica. FDA got off to kind of a quick start. The legislation that you identified was enacted in 2016. And by 2017, which in FDA's world is pretty fast, the agency came out with its first draft on this topic, interpreting this particular statute. I was reminiscing a little bit. It turns out that that draft at the time, we really didn't like it, but in comparison to where we ended up, it may not have been so bad. The main problem with it was that it basically said that the test was whether a doctor or other healthcare professional could arrive at the same conclusion independently of the software. And while that probably works for expert systems, it really doesn't work for machine learning driven algorithms. The whole point of machine learning really being to try and derive insights from larger data sets, and a human being would not be able to do that. And so we filed comments pointing that out. FDA took those comments under advisement and came out with a new proposal in 2019, 2 years later. And the 2019 version was significantly different than the 2017 version in that the FDA grafted on some international consensus work that had been done by a group of regulatory people, meaning not industry people, but actual regulators. This group was called the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, and it's comprised of the FDA type people from around the globe. And they came up with a regulatory approach that sort of tiered the significance of information from low risk to high risk. And FDA grafted that on to this interpretation of US law. And it just didn't fit, because what they wanted to do is restrict the exemption that Congress enacted based on these international requirements. And we objected to that. So then from 2019, you have 3 years of silence. And then all of a sudden, the 2022 final, which bears no resemblance to either the 2017 or the 2019 drafts.
Great. Thanks, Brad. That's really helpful. So I know you've covered it a little bit in your previous response, but could you tell us, with respect to the 2022 guidance, what's the biggest, or what are your biggest shifts or takeaways there between, the most recent guidance and the 2019, or things that we should be paying particular attention to in terms of how, the FDA has really deviated from one draft to the next?
I'd say there are two things that FDA tried to accomplish in the 2022 final. The first is to impose what I would call quality requirements on the data that are used to underpin the recommendation that's made. And so there's language in the final draft about it has to be the equivalent of peer-reviewed literature. And that's a huge problem for anyone, again, who wants to use machine learning, because machine learning typically wouldn't be done on a peer-reviewed set of data. I mean, you could conceivably do it on a set of peer-reviewed articles, and some have done that. But most people, when they use machine learning, use it on real-world evidence. They use it on data that are collected from healthcare providers and others in order to get insights into what those data say. So by imposing quality requirements, the FDA put a major obstacle in the way of anyone who wants to use machine learning. But the other limitation that FDA put is that it really can't be a recommendation. And that sounds funny, because the statute expressly says this is for the purpose of supporting recommendations. And what FDA wants to argue is that the only thing that's permitted under the exempt category is a broad list of possibilities, not a singular recommendation for a healthcare professional to adopt. And their justification for it is that healthcare professionals are apparently too susceptible to simply doing whatever a machine tells them. They call it automation bias, and they inject it with a single footnote to the FAA that apparently references experience with pilots relying too much on autopilot instead of staying mentally alert. And they want to say that doctors and other healthcare professionals are subject to the same risk of automation bias. Those are the two main conceptual shifts that were not in the 2019 draft.
One thing that you touched on was really the fact that the 2022 guidance deviates from some of the explicit intent that was in the original law. Could you dig in a little bit more about that and tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on what authority FDA may have to deviate as far as it has in this guidance, and what we should be making of that?
Well, it's a timely question, Jessica, because we're in the midst of doing a legal analysis and looking at the rules of statutory construction, which, as you know, as a lawyer and anyone who practices law recognizes that an agency's first obligation is to take what the statute says and apply it, and only get creative, as it were, if there's an ambiguity. But if the statute is plain on its face, we are all, the agency and the industry and the public generally, obliged to follow what Congress has said. And so we're going through this analysis to really show that the statute is pretty plain in its intent to exempt from FDA regulation any analysis done of data without limitation to quality and presented in any form of a recommendation, whether it's a singular recommendation or a list of possibilities, that all of that is encompassed within the plain language of the statute. And so FDA is not giving Congress the respect it's supposed to give, and it's wanting to revise basically what Congress has already written.
We've talked a bit today about how this clinical decision support guidance really does push the boundaries and really exceeds the FDA's authority. Practically speaking, what does this mean for industry? What is industry's response supposed to be to this guidance document that doesn't, on its face, seem to comport with what, the legislators had asked of the FDA?
I guess broadly speaking, companies have at least three different choices. One is ignore it. In the sense that it's a non-binding guidance. And so the law is what the law is, and it's what the statute says, and they can follow the statute and their own interpretation of the statute and sort of dare FDA to come after them if FDA disagrees. A second option would be to fight with FDA, which would be pushing back on the guidance in some manner. And there's a group of companies that I said are looking into how to professionally push back. And then third is capitulate, which is to say, we don't have the strength, the power, the money, whatever, to fight with FDA. We need to do what they say. And so trying to accommodate what the agency has written in the guidance by limiting themselves to only the highest quality of data and only presenting outputs in the form of lists. Companies are going to have to each do that calculus. It's funny that small companies would say, well, gosh, big companies have it easy because they have the financial power to fight. And large companies say small companies have it easy because we have more to lose. We can't risk what we've maybe spent decades creating. So we can't fight. They each think the other is in a better position when the fact is it's difficult for either one, practically speaking, to take on the 900-pound gorilla. FDA has the weight of the federal government behind it, not just in enforcement, but they're the ones who do all the approvals. So if you're in the regulated space and you depend on FDA for approvals, fighting with the FDA is a very difficult thing to do. So we're trying to figure out that maybe there's strength in numbers and maybe folks coming together and presenting, again, in a professional way, the weaknesses in the FDA's guidance is one way to do it. When it comes to the fighting option, we've only talked so far about the substantive problems with it. We really haven't talked about the procedural problems with the guidance document. And I think those are equally clear. One being that the FDA published this final guidance that departed radically from the draft guidance. And I actually did a calculation on this as a part of a blog post I wrote. Only about a third of the final guidance is the same or similar wording from the draft. 2/3 of the document changed. When you go through a radical change like that, you're supposed to repropose. You're not supposed to go straight to final. You're supposed to put it out there and let people react to it. So you make sure that what you're doing is correct. But the other thing is Congress, in its wisdom, in this instance, anticipated that maybe the exemption wasn't the right thing, and they gave FDA a process, a notice and comment process to publish data showing that there were actually software programs out there that were causing harm that needed to be regulated. And FDA has chosen not to do that. They've chosen to do an end run around it, and that's not right either. So there are deep procedural flaws in the document as well as substantive flaws in the document. I think there's a lot to go after there, quite honestly.
Really interesting. Thank you, Brad. I think it's really helpful for our listeners to be able to understand really both what those procedural issues are, what those substantive issues are, particularly as they're, working to move forward and to change, if at all, or to figure out what exactly they're going to do in response. I know you talked a bit earlier about how companies, regardless of their size, may want to try to grapple with this and to figure out what exactly to do. But do you have any, suggestions for what companies might want to do, or any tips or things that they might want to consider as they're figuring out how to move forward in this space for anyone who's developing any products, anyone who, wants to submit regulatory submissions to FDA? What are things that they should consider doing, particularly as this particular guidance and really industry's response to it remains a little bit in flux at the moment?
I have two pieces of advice, generally speaking. The whole purpose of the 21st Century Cures Act was to say that software that is not a black box, that allows the end user to see the sources of the data and to understand what the algorithm or what the software is doing, so that they can render their own judgment, that software is exempt, is for a company to go back to the fundamentals and say, are we being transparent? Are we avoiding black box status? Are we really communicating enough to the end user? And honestly, almost any company can improve in that regard. I study a lot of this stuff, and I think a lot of companies can increase their candor. And I think that goes a long way to reducing the incentive that FDA might have to come after them. Because if you're being sort of honest, not just honest, but brutally honest with your user about the limited accuracy and maybe the limited data set on which it's trained, so that you can decide whether that data set is similar to your own patient experiences and so forth. So transparency. And then the second thing FDA loves to see is validation. Have you tested your system really in a rigorous way to make sure that it works? And a rigorous way might not mean just a data scientist taking a test data set to determine its accuracy, but going beyond a test data set to do clinical validation or to do external validations to make sure that the software is functioning the way it should in a safe and effective way. Those two things would certainly reduce FDA's incentive for coming after a company. And they're good business, right? Because whether you're talking about FDA or you're talking about the Federal Trade Commission, or you're just talking about liability for what you put out there, validation is a critical step that companies need to do if they're going to put software to be used in a healthcare context. And transparency, warms a lawyer's heart, no matter if it's an FDA lawyer or a product liability lawyer. Being honest with your customer and sort of brutally transparent, those are both major legal benefits that companies ought to consider during this time when the status of the guidance is at best uncertain.
I think we've covered a lot of information today in today's discussion. And at this time, it remains to be seen whether and how FDA will seek to enforce the principles that are set forth in this clinical decision support guidance, or will otherwise respond to any pushback from stakeholders. For our listeners, what do you hope to see over the next few months or the next year with respect to the FDA's regulation in this space? I know you mentioned earlier that there are some efforts currently underway. If you could tell us a little bit about that and maybe give us a little bit of your prediction or forecast for the future, I think that would be really helpful and insightful.
Predictions are always a bit hazardous for a lawyer who's representing a coalition, because I'm not in charge, right? I mean, the coalition's in charge. The coalition will decide. But I will share with you that on February 3rd, the CDS Coalition actually filed a citizens petition challenging FDA's publication of the CDS guidance. And the idea then would be to encourage FDA to reconsider what it's done. I don't know whether they will or not, because this is all very deliberate on their side. I mean, they went right to final knowing that they were making radical changes. So this isn't new to them. The arguments in this paper won't really be new to FDA, but it's our hope too to broaden the stakeholder discussion, because there's a lot of people affected by this, not the least of which, or maybe most centrally, patients, because what we're talking about is limiting access to software that can really improve healthcare. Healthcare professionals are wonderful. They're highly qualified, but they are human, and all humans make mistakes. And really the purpose of software is to sort of be that objective, almost mechanical reminder of what the options are, what the possibilities are, what things they need to think about in order to make sure that they expand their thinking and don't get locked on to, for example, the wrong diagnosis early on. That's one of the reasons that ONC, NIH, and a whole litany of other federal agencies have been encouraging the development of clinical decision support software. And so FDA is swimming against the current. They're trying to impose barriers on things that other federal regulators and federal agencies are trying to encourage. So the discussion has to broaden beyond FDA. It has to broaden to some of these other stakeholders who have a very legitimate concern about this. And that'll take place in the weeks and months down the road, and we'll see what comes of it.
I think, you and I and everyone else who's listening will be really interested to see what comes out of this and to see what happens next.
Agreed. I wish I had a crystal ball. It'll be interesting to put it mildly.
Yes, I agree. So before we wrap up for today, is there anything else that you'd like to talk about or that you'd like to leave our listeners with respect to this guidance, or really just our overall conversation about clinical decision support and how industry may want to react or decide to move forward in the coming weeks and months and years ahead?
Well, the only thing I would say is this coalition that we're representing is not meant to be an exclusive club, far from it. We really want different perspectives in it. And so it's meant to be a big tent. So if you're a healthcare professional, if you are a hospital or a provider group or a payer group or anyone else who's interested in CDS, we welcome your participation in the coalition. It's free. We want to encourage the broadest discussion among people with different perspectives, because at the end of the day, we want to do the right thing, and we need to hear all those different points of view. So I would just encourage folks to get involved, and the only thing it costs you is your time. We do expect people to actively participate, to make their voices heard. So I would encourage folks who are interested to maybe call you or me or whatever.
Great. Thanks, Brad. I think this has been an incredibly informative discussion today, and I really do appreciate you taking the time to talk with us about clinical decision support and to let us know a little bit more about what you're working on to help companies who are working in this space.
Thank you for inviting me, Jessica. I enjoyed the discussion.
Great. And thank you to all of our listeners. I'm your host, Jessika Tuazon. If you like what you heard today, please don't forget to subscribe. Diagnosing Healthcare is available wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening to Diagnosing Healthcare. For show notes on today's episode, additional episodes, and more insights on trending issues in healthcare, please visit diagnosinghealthcare.com and be sure to subscribe on your preferred platform. The Employment Law This Week and Diagnosing Healthcare podcasts are presented by Epstein Becker Green, PC. All rights are reserved. This audio recording includes information about legal issues and legal developments. Such materials are for informational purposes only and may not reflect the most current legal developments. These informational materials are not intended and should not be taken as legal advice on any particular set of facts or circumstances, and these materials are not a substitute for the advice of competent counsel. The content reflects the personal views and opinions of the participants. No attorney-client relationship has been created by this audio recording. This audio recording may be considered attorney advertising in some jurisdictions under the applicable law and ethical rules. The determination of the need for legal services and the choice of a lawyer are extremely important decisions and should not be based solely upon advertisements or self-proclaimed expertise. No representation is made that the quality of the legal services to be performed is greater than the quality of legal services performed by other lawyers.